I'd call those inputs. What they say is you actually need outputs. You need results, and you need metrics or measuring sticks to be able to show that you're making progress toward the intended goal. And, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that this document citing these experts be made part of the record at the end of my remarks.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, I hope my colleagues will vote to take up my amendment. I understand the Majority Leader will likely move to table it in short order, and I hope my colleagues will vote no on that motion to table, because I think this is an important building block in terms of restoring Congress's and the federal government's credibility when it comes to our broken immigration system. Mr. President, I would yield the floor and reserve the balance of my time. May I ask, Mr. President, how much time remains?
Your time has expired.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Vermont.
President, I ask consent the call of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this legislation has been pending on the floor since the beginning of last week. We actually should have started disposing of amendments during the first week the bill was on the Senate floor, but we've seen objection after objection. Those are opposed, and they're very much in the minority, to this legislation. They objected proceeding to comprehensive immigration reform. That cost us several days. To show that they are a minority when we finally ended that filibuster so we could proceed the bill, 84 senators voted to proceed. Now, I realize some would rather not have any votes one way or the other. It allows you to go home and say, whether somebody's for or against it, yes, I'm working on that because I voted maybe. Well, is there any wonder why we're at such a low level of approval in the American people's eyes, the whole Congress? They expect us to vote yes or no. Sometimes you have to vote something unpopular. Well, we're elected for 6-year terms. We're supposed to do that. We're supposed to represent over 300 million Americans, 100 of us. The American people don't want us to just delay and delay so we don't have to vote, so we can go back home and say, oh, I'm on your side, no matter what your side is. No, they expect us to vote yes or no, even though it may be controversial. Last week and this week, I've been working closely with the Majority Leader and Senator Grassley and others to make progress. We can start voting on amendments in an orderly fashion, but we still face objection. Now, there's been 250 amendments filed to this bill. So far, we considered 11 of them. 11 votes, endless delays. We could be spending months on it. The American people expect us to have the courage to vote yes or no. So, a lot of senators not on the Judiciary Committee who have amendments here. They're non-controversial. Many have widespread support. And there ought to be a way to just adopt those. Some are controversial. Well, then let's vote on them. In the committee, in the Judiciary Committee, we considered a total of 212 amendments over an extensive markup. It was 35 hours of debate. More than half the amendments considered were offered by Republican members of the committee. We adopted 135 amendments to improve this legislation. All but 3 were passed with both Democratic and Republican votes. So I hope that Republicans will join me in making an effort to dispose of many non-controversial items. The amendments, including the manager's amendment, are non-controversial. They have widespread support. I mean, let me just talk about some of them. Non-controversial technical amendments have been agreed to by the ranking member and by authors of this bill, the chair and ranking member of the Committee on Homeland Security, Senators Copper and Coburn, amendment by Senator Cochran and Senator Landrieu. I mean, I could go on and on. I see the distinguished majority leader on the floor, and I'm going to yield the floor. I'm going to speak on this further, but my whole point is we have all kinds of non-controversial amendments co-sponsored by Republicans and Democrats alike, both Republicans and Democrats on the same amendment. We ought to just be adopting them and not this stall, because the stall says, I want to vote maybe. I don't want to vote yes or no. I want to vote maybe. Mr. President, I served longer in this body than any current member. I've served here with nearly a fifth of the senators who had the privilege of serving in this body since the beginning of the country. I've known great Republicans and great Democrats who must be wondering in the past, what are we doing? Mr. President, I yield the floor. And
Mr. President, I haven't heard all my friend's statement, but I hope I don't get his staff in trouble. We've been visiting here while he's been talking, and we have a list of 27 amendments here that the chair has come up with that are non-controversial. One of them, I was surprised that you couldn't put on the list because a Republican senator objected because they thought it was controversial because that we should do things in this bill, this immigration bill, for the best interest of the child. That's controversial, which kind of surprised me.
I hear a lot of speeches about we should support family values, as both the senator from Nevada and I do. But when you try to put in a bill that's obviously a family value, protecting children, then we have objection. Well, if you don't like the amendment, vote against it. Well, let's vote on it.
While Senator Landrieu was here on the floor last night, we had a colloquy back and forth a little bit. And my friend, the chairman of the committee, and I can lament about the days when we would bring a bill to the floor and Energy and Water Appropriations Bill. The two of us have been longtime members of the Appropriations Committee. We would do Senator Bennett Johnson and I, Pete Domenici when he was a ranking member with me, we would do the Energy and Water Bill in a couple hours. A bill that was extremely important for the country. It provided the security for our nuclear weaponry. But now anymore we don't do that. These 27 amendments here, it's a sad commentary and things, but these things would be accepted not in a manager's amendment, Mr. President, not a manager's amendment. They would just be done by unanimous consent. But anyway, we can't do that. Mr. President, I call for regular order with respect to the Cornyn Amendment number 1251.
Amendment number 1251 is now pending.
I move to table the Corn Amendment, ask for the unanimous consent there be 2 minutes equally divided prior to the vote on my motion to table.
Is there
And,
objection? Without objection.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered. Republican Whip.
Mr. President, the Majority Leader's moved to table my amendment, which provides a guarantee of actual results rather than false promises, which have been a sad litany of most of our history when it comes to immigration reform and border security. Starting in 1986, when Ronald Reagan signed an amnesty for 3 million people premised on enforcement, the American people, in their typical generosity and compassion, accepted that based on the representation that it would never happen again. In 1996, 17 years ago, President Bill Clinton signed into law the requirement for a biometric entry-exit system, which would address the 40% of illegal immigration that occurs because people enter legally and simply overstay and are melted into the great American landscape unless they happen to commit a crime or otherwise caught by law enforcement. We cannot ask the American people trust us because of this litany and sad story of broken promises when it comes to immigration reform. That's why we need real enforcement. That's why my amendment needs to pass and not be tabled.
From Vermont.
Mr. President, I support the tabling of it. There may be some good parts in it, but most of it is bad. The billions of additional taxpayer dollars I cannot support with all the billions we already have in here. But the biggest reason I won't support it, it imposes new unrealistic triggers. It says to people, we want to give you a pathway to citizenship, but guess what? We're going to keep the door closed. You can pretend you're going to citizenship. We're going to make it impossible. We have a fully biometric exit system, all air and seaports as a trigger. Well, most airports are not going to be able to do this. Certainly not the little airports that many of us fly in and out of. They're unrealistic. So, Mr. President, I realize my time is up. I put my full statement on the record, but I strongly oppose this amendment, and I would vote to table.
The question is on the motion to table. The yeas and nays have been ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett. Sure. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Bennett, Blumenthal, Cardin, Heinrich, Leahy, Paul, Schatz, and Stabenow. Senators voting in the negative: Coates, Grassley, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Sessions, and Toomey. Mr. Alexander. No. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Chiesa, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin? No. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey? Aye. Mrs. Boxer? Mrs. Boxer? Aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, no. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane? Aye. Mr. Coburn? Mr. Coburn? No. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, no. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Cowan, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye.
Oh, it's not. It is.
Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu. Aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, no. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. No. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, no.
I'm going to go no on that.
Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Moran.
No.
Mr. Moran, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no.
No, wait a minute. I'm sorry.
It's a Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, no.
Exactly. I went with that.
Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye.
You know what, I need one more. I'm sorry, I need one.
Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Vitter. No. $54.
Paul voted to table.
Senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 54, the nays are 43. The motion to table is agreed to.
Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The majority leader?
Mr. President, the managers of this bill, the floor staff, people are working to try to come up with a path forward on this legislation. We have a number of senators who are concerned about amendments that they feel are not, what's the right word? Controversial. I like that word too. Controversial. And so that's one track we're trying to come up with. The other track is the number of senators are working with a gang of 8 to come up with a major amendment dealing with, as I understand it, border security and a number of other things. I am also told that that amendment is being drafted at Legislative Council. So I hope that we can have that amendment soon so people can look at it. And I hope we can do something with the non-controversial amendments. In the meantime, we just have to understand, Mr. President, this is not easy to do, but I think we have a path forward. I am grateful to everyone for being as understanding as they are. Because legislation is not easy, especially on a major piece of legislation like this. But I do say this. This is not one of those bills that suddenly appeared on the Senate floor. People have been working on this legislation for months. The Gang of 8 has been working on this. We had one of the most thorough markups in recent history in the Senate. Hundreds of amendments were considered. Scores were accepted. Democratic amendments, Republican amendments. So this legislation we have on the floor is not as if suddenly it's here and not much has been done about it. So again, I repeat what I said before. We're trying to find a way forward on this. In the meantime, I ask unanimous consent that Senator Toomey, Senator Landrieu, and then Senator Cruz be recognized for 10 minutes each in the sequence that I just mentioned.
Without objection.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, pursuant to the unanimous consent agreement.
The Senate will be in order. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I would like to begin by commending my many colleagues who've put a lot of time and effort into this bill, to attempting to refine it, to this amendment process. But I have to say, with all due respect, I think a great portion of the debate we've been having in this body misses the fundamental point, the most important aspect of what we ought to be addressing in immigration.
The Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations off the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. If you think about it, we've spent a lot of time working on and talking about what we do with the people who are here illegally, and there's a path to citizenship in this underlying bill for those folks. We've talked an awful lot about border security, and border security is an important issue, but I'm strongly of the view that while that is important, border security reform is not sufficient to solve the immigration problem that we have. And I would point out that however high we choose to build a wall on our border, someone can always build a ladder that's 1 foot taller. Mr. President, I think the most important part of this whole debate ought to be about what do we do about the next wave of immigrants, the next group of people who want to come to this country, future immigration that is certainly going to happen. And I think to address that, we ought to think about what drives the immigration that's been happening, much of which has been illegal. And I'm here to tell you, I think what drives it is poor people who have very meager prospects, who want to come to a rich country where there are great opportunities. It's people who want to work hard and build a better life for themselves and their families. It happens to be the exact same thing that drove every previous wave of immigration. I think about the 25-year-old Mexican guy in central Mexico who lives in a poor community where prospects are grim and the standard of living is miserable, and he wants to come here to build a better life. And you know what? He does so in the same way that my grandparents in Ireland and my great-grandparents in Portugal wanted to come here for the exact same reason. And you know, my ancestors, they had very little education. They had no skills. They came to this country to work, and that's what they did. And when they did that, they didn't weaken America. They didn't weaken our economy. They helped to build this country. They helped to build this economy, as all of our ancestors did. And that's true of immigrants who want to come here and work. And we ought to have a legal avenue that allows these people who want to build a better life for themselves, and in the process will build a better America. We ought to allow that to happen. This bill, in my view, doesn't go nearly far enough in accommodating the legal immigration that we could and should have in this country, especially with respect to low-skilled workers. Now, I'll be the first to say the bill makes a lot of progress for high-skilled workers in two big areas. The H-1B visas, the cap that has been too low for too long, is significantly raised, and although we've created hoops that people have to go through that are probably unnecessary, it is progress that we have a much higher cap. There's also a new opportunity for graduate students in the STEM fields to get green cards in time, and that is very, very constructive. These people come here with a great deal of human capital, intellectual capital. They're trained in fields where we need these skills, and the last thing we should do is send them home to compete against us. It's terrific that this bill addresses that by welcoming these folks. But I have to tell you, for the category of low-skilled, non-agricultural, legal immigration, this bill is wildly inadequate. I say that because the visa that is created to accommodate these folks has, I think, terribly low caps. In the first year, the cap is a mere 20,000 people. 20,000. The next year it's 35. It goes up to 75 eventually. These are absurdly low numbers by any reasonable measure. Frankly, you could consider this the anti-immigration bill because these numbers are so low, and this is the category where there is the greatest interest in immigrating. I would point out that early in the last decade, according to the Pew Hispanic Center, there were 800,000 people coming here every year. In 2007, the Kennedy-McCain immigration reform bill was reported out of committee with the support of Senator Kennedy, and that allowed for 400,000 guest worker visas each year. Yesterday, or the day before, the CBO came out with a score of this underlying bill, and interestingly, they predict that fully 75% of all the future illegal immigration that is currently expected under current law will occur under this bill. And I think part of the reason is because we're not providing an adequate avenue, a legal avenue, for people who want to come here and work hard. And so I've got an amendment, Mr. President, and I'll have more to say about this later, but I wanted to just mention this to my colleagues and urge their consideration. It's an amendment that lifts the caps each year. In the first year, it takes the cap up to 200,000. It then goes to 250, 300, and finally 350,000 in the fourth year. I would point out that these caps on the W visas, the low-skilled worker visas, would still be lower in the fourth year than what Senator Kennedy agreed to in the first year, just a few years ago. It doesn't change the wage protections that are in the underlying bill. A worker would still need a sponsoring employer. All of those provisions stay the same. But we at least would increase the opportunity of people who want to come here legally and work hard to build a better life. Now, I know some of my friends, especially on the other side, are going to oppose this. But I will tell you, if we do not raise the caps for the low-skilled workers who want to come to this country, then the next wave of illegal immigration is guaranteed, regardless of what we do at the border. And anybody who thinks that more legal immigration of people who want to come here and work hard for themselves and their family, if they think that that is harmful to our economy or to America, and we need to keep those people out, as I'm afraid to say this bill does, that is a profound misreading of American history. Throughout all of our history, from before we even became an independent republic, the story of America has been one wave of immigrant after another. And while millions of people were coming to this country, what was happening to America? We were becoming richer. Wages were rising, our economy was growing, our standard of living was increasing. That's what happens when people come here to work. They increase the size of our economy. We shouldn't view our economy as a pie where we're all fighting for a slice, and we don't want somebody else to get a bigger slice, because what happens when people come here through a legal system to work hard, they increase the size of the pie. They're consumers. They become investors. They become contributors to our economy and to our country, just as every single wave previous to them, including my grandparents and my grandparents and all of our ancestors, did as well. Mr. President, I think this is the central challenge. Fix the broken immigration system so that we won't have the next wave of illegal immigration, so that we can continue to build a stronger economy that these folks will help to build. I think we need to address these caps as a part of the process of doing that. I want to thank Ron Johnson, my colleague, Senator Johnson from Wisconsin, for co-sponsoring this. I know a number of other colleagues are interested in sponsoring this, and I'll have more to say about this later in the week or next week. But I really think this is a very, very important topic that we need to address in this debate, and I appreciate the time, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator